Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie, and this is episode number 1022 for September 17th, 2023. Coming up in a few minutes.
People have seen just a glimpse of what we're capable of. I think the best years are ahead of us. We have more barrels than we've ever had. We've been diligently laying those down and being patient. We've tasted some of the barrels out of the new Naval Base warehouse. The flavor's better. So I think batch 100 is going to be a heck of a lot better than batch 33. So if people are like, oh, this is really great, it's like, well, just wait. We're just getting started.
High Wire Distilling founders and Marshall and Scott Blackwell celebrated their distillery's 10th anniversary last weekend with a big party in Charleston, South Carolina. The two started out with no distilling experience between them, but their work over the years has helped them become respected within the distilling community. Our conversation is coming up in a few minutes on WhiskyCast In-Depth. I'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, behind the label, and much more. The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Small batch. How would you describe it? It's like an Irishman's understanding of baseball. Extremely limited.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
How about a really great 12-year-old Scotch whiskey? I have a stellar recommendation coming up for you in just a minute. Spoiler alert, it's Dewar's 12-year-old.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by the Dalmore. We'll begin with a couple of distillery sales this week. Italy's Ilva Serrano Holdings is buying a majority stake in Baltimore's Sagamore Spirit Distillery from Kevin Plank's Sagamore Ventures. The Maryland Rye Distillery was founded 10 years ago and is located in the heart of the Sagamore Ventures Baltimore Peninsula development. Rob Collins of Di Serrano International, the U.S. arm of Ilva Serrano, says the acquisition will help the company build a foothold in the U.S. market.
We're an Italian family-owned company with over 500 years of legacy and heritage. But in the last decade, we really wanted to get into the premium international spirits business in other unique categories. And I think that started with an acquisition of Tia Maria a number of years ago, led into us then purchasing and building the Royal Oak Distillery in Ireland. We have a joint venture and an equity relationship with Indian Gin out of Italy. But really to step into it and make a major splash into American whiskey and specifically Maryland Rye with Sagamore Spirit. And Kevin Plank was part of our overall strategic plan to become a premium player in the space.
And you liked Sagamore so much you're moving the company headquarters to Baltimore.
We are. I think it's quite unique what Kevin has done with Baltimore Peninsula and the investment done there through Sagamore Ventures. So, like I said, we are a legacy company with a home in Serrano, Italy. But in the United States, having an office space in, suburban New Jersey didn't ever feel like home. So now that we have this opportunity to have a distillery and people in the community, it makes perfect sense to move our North American headquarters to Baltimore.
Ilva Serrano also owns the Royal Oak Whiskey Distillery in County Carlow, Ireland, and it's the Busker whiskey brand. No purchase price was announced, and we need to note that Sagamore Spirit is a sponsor of WhiskyCast. Meanwhile, International Beverage is buying the Cardrona Distillery in New Zealand from its founders. The deal puts Cardrona in the InBev portfolio alongside Balblair, Anach, Old Pulteney, and Speyburn in the company's single malt whiskey range. Co-founder Desiree Whitaker will stay on as managing director following the sale. Argyll and Butte Council has granted planning permission for the second of 3 proposed distilleries in the Campbellton area of Scotland. The council signed off on plans for the Dalriada Distillery to be built on the banks of Campbellton Loch. The £4.5 million project is expected to create around 20 jobs for the area. Earlier this year, we featured Phil and Simon Thompson of Dornoch's Thompson Brothers and the Dornoch Distillery. Got word this week that Highland Council has granted planning permission for their new distillery to be built near the existing facility in Dornoch. In other news, the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame inducted its class of 2023 Wednesday during a luncheon at the Log Still Distillery just ahead of the Kentucky Bourbon Festival. As we reported earlier this summer, the class includes Michter's CEO Joe Magliocco, former Beam Master distiller Jerry Dalton, Jefferson's Bourbon founders Chet and Trey Zeller, and former Louisville Mayor Greg Fisher. Maureen Robinson's retirement from Diageo didn't last long. The longtime master blender has joined Stoli Group's Kentucky Owl Bourbon as its master blender. The move came out of a collaboration between Robinson and retiring Kentucky Owl master blender John Shea. They had been working together on the third release in Kentucky Owl's Collaborators series, the new Meester edition.
Oh, I was approached by Kentucky Owl to do this third expression of the Collaborators, and I thought this is really interesting because I've never worked with bourbon before, and at first I thought, well, for a one-off project I'd be really interested to do it, and now of course it's now been announced that I'm now actually going to be the master blender for Kentucky Owl, and so I've kind of decided to unretire myself for a few years.
What's the biggest difference between blending Scotch and blending bourbons now that you've done one?
To be quite honest, the process is very similar because if you think about in bourbon, you've got mash bills. So you get different flavours coming depending what mash bill is. And so you could think of it from a Scotch perspective, that's the equivalent of a distillery. So you've got all the different, you've got different mash bills, different distilleries. Also, you've got different ages, the same, so the flavours affected by age. It's also, you've got the casks. In the Scotch industry, we always use almost like second-hand casks. And so, but then in the bourbon industry, because you're using new casks, but you can actually get flavours by the charring of the cask. The way you char the cask, if you do a lighter char from a heavier char, then you'll get different flavours coming through on the whiskey.
How did you get your head wrapped around bourbon when you started this project?
It took a while to get my head around the bourbon because I was so used to the Scotch attributes and the aromas and flavours. But I must admit, when I got what we termed as building blocks for this project, I was actually amazed at just how many characters in the bourbon were similar to what Scotch was.
What was the basis for this whiskey?
The basis was to try and come up with a bourbon that nosed and tasted like Scotch. So when we actually started the process, John, who I was working with on this project, he actually brought in lots of samples from, with his experience from the bourbon side of the business, but he's also had a wee bit of experience in Scotch and what the flavours were for Scotch. So what he did was he brought a lot of samples in, and he actually did a lot of pre-blending of the samples to make up these 4 building blocks for this project. And he then passed these building blocks on to me, and I then had a look at them. He also actually did some recipes that he'd made up, of what he thought was quite similar to a Scotch. But when I nosed and tasted, what I then did was I then picked the one I thought was the most, to me, was the most Scotch-like. But I then started playing around with that one blend as a base and started tweaking things here and there and came up with one that I thought was a bit closer. I then passed that on to John. He then made it up and he did his own nosing and tasting, and I'm glad to say we both were in agreement that this was the one that we wanted to put in the bottle, and it's now called Meester.
Now that you're the master blender for Kentucky Owl, do you plan any changes to the blend, or do you intend just to keep it the same?
No, I intend to keep things the same. It's like, even when I was in the Scotch industry, if people got taken over things, people thought you were going to change things. But no, as far as I'm concerned, I'm the custodian of Kentucky Owl. I'm not here to make changes. I'll be there to keep the flavour and the aroma as it has been, and I'm there to sort of make sure the quality is the same as what it was when it was under John's watch. And I just don't, where there will be changes if creating something new, but for anything that's existing, I'm there to make sure it stays the same, the quality stays the same as what Kentucky Owl has been all the years gone by.
The Meester edition is a blend of 4, 5, 8, and 9-year-old bourbons with both rye forward and wheated mash bills. It'll carry a recommended retail price of $150 a bottle. I'll have my tasting notes for it later on. Kentucky Owl founder Dixon Dedman moved on a couple of years ago, and his latest 2 times oak releases includes his first single-barrel whiskey. It's called Gem of Kentucky and joins the tribute blend honoring his family and a new everyday sipper in American oak. There's no word on pricing. I'll have tasting notes soon at the WhiskyCast website. Redbreast is out with the 3rd release in its Iberian series. The Tawny Port Cask edition is, as you might guess from the name, heavily influenced by Tawny Port casks from Portugal. Master blender Billy Layton took whiskey matured in bourbon and Oloroso casks and put some of it into Tawny Port casks, then eventually married all 3 in freshly seasoned Tawny Port hogsheads for up to 2 years before bottling. It'll be available starting this week in the U.S., Ireland, the UK, China, Australia, Canada, France, Germany, and global travel retail, with a recommended retail price of $100 a bottle. And Sweden's Mackmyra distillery is releasing the first 20-year-old Swedish single malt this week. Just 238 bottles came from the first cask to be filled at Mackmyra back on December 20th of 2002. It'll be available at Sweden's Systembolaget for special orders starting Wednesday and in select export markets. There's no word on pricing. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com and in the WhiskyCast community app. The news is brought to you by the Dalmore.
Hello, Richard Patterson here, Master Distiller, Master Blender for the Dalmore. You know, whenever the team and I are in the world sharing our exceptional single malt, we like to keep in touch with Mark Gillespie and the latest news from WhiskyCast.
Let's take a look at the calendar of upcoming whiskey events going on around the world. The Scotch Malt Whiskey Society has its annual gathering events coming up this week on Tuesday in Washington, D.C., and Thursday night in San Francisco. Just Whiskey is this coming weekend in Hamburg, Germany, along with Whiskey by the Sea in Vlissingen, the Netherlands, and Whiskey X Houston. Catoctin Creek Distilling has another one of its distillery dinners planned for September 29th in Purcellville, Virginia. The Whiskey Show takes place in London September 30th and October 1st, and that same weekend is the Ghent Whiskey Festival in Ghent, Belgium. Finally, Whiskey at the Beach is October 5th in Long Branch, New Jersey. If you're organizing a whiskey event, let us know about it. We'll add it to the calendar at whiskycast.com and in the WhiskyCast community app.
Gabriel here. The new Dewar's 12-year-old has been completely remastered to be richer, smoother, and more balanced. It's a total winner. It's double-aged in first fill premium bourbon casks for greater depth and breadth of flavor, with notes of apples, lemon zest, and spicy and floral notes with a long, smooth vanilla finish. The experts agree too. It's winning awards like pros sink putts. In fact, WhiskyCast's own Mark Gillespie gave it a 94-point rating, which is pretty amazing for a 12-year-old Scotch. It's also earned a 94-point rating from Whiskey Advocate. That makes it their highest-rated 12-year-old Scotch whiskey. It's an excellent testament to the skill, craft, and refinement of the world's most awarded blended Scotch whiskey, Dewar's. Drink responsibly. Copyright 2023 Dewar's Blended Scotch Whiskey, 40% alcohol by volume.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Mortlach and the Classic Malts lineup. A lot of craft distilleries have been marking their 10th anniversaries over the last couple of years, following the boom in small-scale distilling that started in late 2011 and continues to this day. High Wire Distilling in Charleston, South Carolina celebrated its 10th anniversary this past week. The distillery is most widely known for its Jimmy Red Bourbon, distilled from what some might call an heirloom grain, but really it should be considered an endangered grain, since a few years ago only 2 cobs of Jimmy Red were known to be in existence. Scott Blackwell and Ann Marshall have been cultivating Jimmy Red for the last few years, starting out with a 2-acre experimental plot and a crop that's grown to 420 acres this year. The corn itself is dark red and produces a whiskey with a unique flavor all its own. I spent some time with Scott and Ann last weekend during a break in the celebrations. So 10 years in, what have you learned?
Well, we've learned a lot, and the good news is we keep learning, which is so valuable to us. I mean, I feel like every portal we walk through reveals a whole new universe of things we need to learn. So it's fun to be at year 10.
I think what I've learned that's been really fun is I've learned, I'm going to be sappy and say I've learned how awesome it is to see people come together and see a community come up around you when you believe in something, and then they kind of pile in around you and nurture you along, and they're willing to jump in selflessly. That's been probably the biggest surprise, is how giving people have been along the way, and how incredible the power of passion that I think we exude, that maybe shows people it's like they're putting the work in, so I'm going to help them. It's the old helping people who are helping themselves type thing, and that's been really, really beyond money or anything else. The most rewarding piece of this is having our farmers, when we're out of the room, talking about us and saying, these guys, I believe in them because they took this chance, and I'm willing to take that chance with them, and that's a big deal.
Part of that's that relationship you guys have built with Julian and Preston Van Winkle.
Yeah, I think Julian has always, both of them, we know both of them pretty well. We've hung around with Julian more. He's always been super nice and humble and down to earth. The thing that over the years, he went from sort of curiously looking at us and going, what's this craft distilling thing all about? Not just us, but the whole universe, to, wow, you've sort of changed my mind about corn. I never really thought about that before. And then having somebody like that say, your white dog is the best that I've ever had. Well, I know what that means is we have promise. He's careful with his praise, but then, he's gone on outside of being around us and talking to Whiskey Advocate or somebody like that and putting it in print and saying, you should be buying this. And it's like, wow, that's pretty awesome. And I think we like one another, but I think that's the whiskey doing the talking, and I think it's pretty cool to have somebody who's been in the business that many years and that well respected to say, you guys are doing something right, keep doing it. And it gives us a little bit of, it's an unknown land that we're a universe that we're walking into, so it gives us a little more confidence to keep doing it and to work harder. So,
and he's an incredible bellwether for the industry. He's seen so much, he's forgotten more than we'll ever know. But it's interesting in this incredible boom that we're in the middle of to have somebody like Julian who's seen so much and hear his perspective of what's happening in the whiskey industry as a whole right now. So we appreciate his insights always. We appreciate his caution and his wisdom. And it's been, they're such great people, Julian, Sissy, Preston, all of them. And really, I feel like we were friends with him before we were industry mates with him, which always helps.
You mentioned that you taught Julian about corn. The corn is really what sets you guys apart. With the Jimmy Red corn is where you've sort of built your let me put it this way: put your sort of flag in the ground with Jimmy Red. Tell me about the Jimmy Red experience.
It's been a journey. We really have stumbled through the darkness a little bit, not knowing exactly how it would yield or if it would grow or if we'd be able to scale it up. And you hear so much about heirloom crops and they disappeared for a reason. And there's a lot of bashing in that particular department. But Scott and I are stubborn people, if nothing else. So I think it was a challenge that we were adamant about because we wanted to really do something distinctive. And originally it was that very thing. We wanted to do something distinctive. But the more we learned about corn, the more we researched with Glenn, with Clemson, with Brian Ward, with all of these people that were so invested in that seed stock and in proving something out, the more we just fell in love with the idea that, as a world, as a universe, we are really boxing ourselves out of flavor opportunities. And Jimmy Red for us is just this microcosm of the agricultural world where we're proving that flavor matters. That flavor matters not just for whiskey, but flavor matters for nutrition. Flavor matters for enjoyment. And what are we on this planet for, if not to enjoy ourselves? And that's the layers of the onion we're peeling back with this one varietal of this one crop.
How hard is it to distill Jimmy Red?
I would say that it's no more difficult to distill Jimmy Red than another variety of corn. I don't have any real practice on, say, number 2 Yellow Dent. We've distilled heirlooms of white, blue, yellow, other forms of maize, being the grass teosinte. We've distilled. We've learned, I think, a lot. Through distilling things other than corn that we apply to Jimmy Red. So I think that's the hard part is getting our distilling style, and then just trying not to screw up this really great ingredient that we have, and do the best we can with it. So our rye, on the other hand, is difficult. That's a very difficult grain to work with. But the Jimmy Red itself, it does take longer rests. We do have to rest it longer because of the starch content and everything. It's just really high in starch, but it's also high in oil. So, but I think that's sort of just status quo or standard practice for us nowadays. We really don't think about it a whole lot. It's maybe it's another hour a day or something like that, but we're not turning out numbers like we're worried about. If it takes another hour, it's worth it.
You almost lost this year's crop because of the storms, right?
Yeah, we had a very scary moment. Hurricane Idalia came up from Florida. We thought it was going to be nothing, although there's always the fear that it will be something. Charleston is no stranger to these storms. And we had a very chill day here, to be honest. We had the worst of our storm at 1 p.m., but the hurricane didn't hit till 8 p.m. We were at home at that point. I think we got a half an inch of rain here in Charleston, but inland, our farms are all about an hour inland, and they were just getting crushed. I think they got 7 to 9 inches of rain. The winds were up to 70, 80 miles an hour. And Jimmy Red corn is very top-heavy. The cobs tend to exist in the top third of the stalk. So there's always been a lot of fear about it bending at the root because the root structure needs to be planted very deep. But it bent at the waist of the stalk, which was okay for a time. In Mexico, they actually, the first part of hand harvesting, which that's pretty much the only way they harvest, but is to break the stalk so that the corn cobs will dry out, so they can get that natural drying process on the plant. And so the hurricane actually did that for us naturally. The hard part is that the combine doesn't work very efficiently when the stalk is bent. We're pulling in the final I'd say 40 acres this week of that hurricane crop, and it's deteriorating by day, but we're still seeing some pretty nice bushel per acre averages in the 70s, which is really good for Jimmy Red. And our farmers are all used to this, but it was certainly we always worry about this because we're harvesting in the middle of hurricane season every year, like a lot of growers across the country, whether it's wine producers in California. Everyone seemed to have this really late spring frost that has extended grape harvest times by 2-3 weeks. And we saw the same thing, which pushed us further into hurricane season.
Yeah, I would add that it's always a delicate dance that we do with heirloom variety, open pollinated type corns that tend to grow higher. They are natural. So therefore they're more wild, I guess would be a good word, versus a modified variety. So, when we first started growing this, our farmers, we met with geneticists, and the geneticist said, well, what would you like to see? And the farmers were like, we'd like it this high and the cob being right here. And he was like, if we start doing that, it's going to change the plant. Therefore, it's going to change the characteristics. And most of our farmers are conventional farmers. They grow soybeans and yellow corn and cotton and peanuts. They went to, your ag schools, and they were trained up on sort of the modern practices. So for them, the one thing we hear every year is like, well, I wonder if there's any way we can get these stalks a little thicker or whatever. And it's like, and one of the geneticists that works in Mexico said, listen, you start inbreeding or start changing that, you're going to change that. It's not going to be the same flavor. It's going to change the whole dynamicness of this corn. So we have to kind of gently sort of bring these guys to the water and say, look, we understand. That's why we're paying more per acre. We got crop insurance this year. It took us several years to establish that. We're just sort of slowly pushing, but we haven't been able to change everything we wanted to change or get everything exactly how we wanted it. So it's, this year was a definite learning experience from the storms, but I think the first reports that we were hearing were 95% loss. And now we're hearing, it's actually a bumper crop. This stuff's stronger than we thought. It broke right in the right place. And I think they're becoming more bigger believers in this corn. It's been around for thousands of years. It's sustained a lot of changes, and I think it's a lot more durable than I think all of us think. So but there again, it's this weaving straight road that we have to kind of maintain, and we've been maintaining that for many, many years now, and learning every year is a new experience, I would say.
Give me an idea of what the next 10 years looks like, Ann.
Wow. I wish I had a crystal ball. I think we are going to continue to go deeper down this agricultural path. I think we're going to I know we're looking at other varietals of corn and other heirloom grains. We're going to do a lot of experimentation. We've got a grain lab we're setting up here where we can really study different flavor profiles of grains that we're not using currently, and other vegetables and fruits. And we're always really curious about brandies. It's not a viable category for us as a business, but everything we do with fruits and vegetables tends to really inform our whiskey making process for the better. We have a winemaker's approach. We always have. So any experiments we can do on a small scale that really help us reveal flavor in the way that distillation has since the dawn of time is an invaluable experience and a learning experience for us. We tell our team all the time, like, if you think you've learned everything you can here, it's time to move on, because this is just a playground of learning, and that's what we're doing. And if you're not curious and if you're not asking questions every day about how we can do this better or what we don't know, then, it's time to move on.
Yeah, I would add that I think that people have seen just a glimpse of what we're capable of. I think the best years are ahead of us. We have more barrels than we've ever had. We've been diligently laying those down and being patient. We've tasted some of the barrels out of the new naval base warehouse. The flavor's better. So I think batch 100 is going to be a heck of a lot better than batch 33. So if people are like, oh, this is really great, it's like, well, just wait. We're just getting started. We're on the front cusp of that. So I'm excited because it has been a tremendous amount of work to get to this place where we are now. But we can see we're sort of cresting a hill finally, and I think we can get more visibility and we can really go out and start to tell our story and really have something to back it up. Which we haven't had. I mean, we've had few bottles here and there, and now it's like, no, we've got more now, so we don't need to be in all the places, we just need to be in the right places, and we need to be talking to people who want to listen and keep doing what we're doing, and I think it's just going to create more and more of a groundswell for what we're doing here. We looked very hard early on, when Glenn first introduced us to Jimmy Red, we looked really hard at, I was like, this guy's never made whiskey before. What does he know about what we should do? So we ended up, that first couple of years, we distilled a bunch of different varieties of corn because I was like, there's got to be a better one. It wasn't like, that's it, and we're going to just go with that. It was like we continued to explore, and I think now that we have a base of learnings, like Ann said, we're going to be adding more varietals experiments. We're going to do just like we did with Jimmy Red, where it's going to be a long, slow road. So that's going to be in parallel. There's still going to be that frustrating waiting game, but I think now we've got a platform to build on, scaling up from that 2 acres to 420 acres. That was difficult. It wasn't just plant some more seed. It took a lot of learnings to get to that place. Seed, speaking of that stewardship, that basically biosecurity of protecting that seed and nurturing it. You can't just take this stuff out of the field and throw it back in the ground every year. You've got to take care of that seed. You've got to hand select, hand harvest, do a lot more than you would with a conventional. But we feel like that flavor difference is worth it. We're not saying we're better. The whiskey's better than this. We just think it's really cool to bring something different, but that's as good as other whiskeys that are out there. I'm excited about the American whiskey, what's going on in American whiskey overall, because I think you're starting to get whiskeys that are popping up all around the country that are really delicious, and it's just nice to be amongst those. I think it's so I think we're going to see the next 10 years where it's going to be a little bit bigger clubhouse, but that's okay. I think there's enough people out there that want that and want that choice, and as a whiskey drinker, I'm excited to be able to go to the store and find brands I haven't heard of before, or see brands that have evolved and like us, and they're making better whiskey, and I get to go back and try that.
Thanks to Ann Marshall and Scott Blackwell for spending some time with us on this week's WhiskyCast In-Depth. And by the way, you can hear my tasting notes for their Bottled in Bond anniversary edition of Jimmy Red in last week's episode. Full disclosure, I was their guest in Charleston last weekend for the anniversary celebration, but as always, full editorial control over this episode remains with WhiskyCast. WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Mortlock, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies, comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlock lineup at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. Let's start off with the Kentucky Owl Meester edition we heard about during the news. It's bottled at 50% ABV, and the nose is very Scotch-like, with touches of malted barley, citrus, pineapple, toasted caramel, vanilla, and a hint of blackberries. The taste has notes of baking spices, vanilla pods, touches of orange and grapefruit, and caramel in nice balance, while the finish is long, warm, and soothing. This one is a bourbon for Scotch lovers who think they don't like bourbons. I'm scoring the Kentucky Owl Meester edition a 94. Now that was a collaboration between master blenders Maureen Robinson and John Ray. The team at Bardstown Bourbon Company collaborated with Chicago's Goose Island Brewing on a bourbon and beer combination. Bardstown Bourbon's blenders took high barley content 6- and 7-year-old bourbons and finished them in Goose Island's Bourbon County Stout beer casks, then blended that whiskey with some 9-year-old bourbon. The final whiskey was bottled at 50% ABV, and the nose has touches of almond oil, dark chocolate fudge, toasted oak, honey, and vanilla buttercream. The taste is thick and oily with notes of allspice, dark chocolate, barley sugar, vanilla, and caramel. The finish, it's nice and long with lingering spices, fudge, and honey in a nice balance. I'm scoring the Bardstown Bourbon Company's Goose Island Collaborative Series bourbon a 93. Finally, let's look at Bruichladdich 11th release of its Black Art Single Malt. As with previous releases, the only thing we know about this whiskey is that it was distilled in 1994 and that it's bottled at 44.2% ABV. Only head distiller Adam Hennett knows the rest of the story behind Black Art. The nose has touches of raspberry jam, citrus, dried flowers, pears, and mangoes. The taste is malty with barley sugar, butterscotch, toasted oak, and a hint of coconut. The finish is long and complex with touches of orange peel, honey, and hints of marzipan, toasted oak, and coconut. This one is a special whiskey. I'm scoring Bruichladdich Black Art 11.1 a 96. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 3,500 different whiskeys from around the world at WhiskyCast.com. Our tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit, a 200-time award-winning Maryland-style rye whiskey. With a determined focus to create the best rye whiskey imaginable, Sagamore's team of distillers crafts each spirit with a nod to both tradition and innovation. Find their signature, Double Oak, Cask Strength, or Reserve Series ryes at a retailer near you. Visit SagamoreSpirit.com. Please drink responsibly.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
So, in Spain, they call Redbreast Petit Roco. It's me, but a touch more exotic. Kind of like a Redbreast PX edition. Finished in Pedro Jimenez casks, adding a velvety and decadent dimension. You know, I won't lie. A climate like this makes me wish I was a migratory bird.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Let's open up the WhiskyCast community app now and see what's happening in our community of whiskey lovers around the world. Just a Fan posted this comment on our interview last month with Philippe Schreiberg of the Rhythm and Booze Project. I was surprised Mark did an interview on the podcast with Rhythm and Booze, but did not include any of their music. You can't share great whiskey on a podcast, but you can share great music. I was lucky to see them at the Edinburgh Fringe, and he added a short clip. Better to see them live and drink scotch while listening. Well, music rights issues kept us from including their music on the podcast. Trust me, I wanted to, but the threat of having the podcast taken down for copyright infringement kept us from doing it. And Juan Cruz posted this comment in the app this week. Just finished another, quote, irreplaceable bottle. Finding certain whiskeys I have come to enjoy are either 1, not available in my local area anymore, or 2, the price change from last time I bought has skyrocketed. For example, I have a bottle of Redbreast 27 that will have to last me a while. The price locally is already $60 USD, higher than 12 months ago. I regret finishing the last Yamazaki 12 bottle. Have you experienced this? If so, what are your thoughts on the topic? Any factors beyond supply and demand that you suspect are at play? Looking forward to your feedback. The Tracer Bullet was one of those who responded. Here's his comment. Oh yeah, prices have gotten nuts in my opinion, partly from supply and demand, partly due to economic factors. But I also feel that some distilleries are taking advantage with all these special releases that cost a lot, and we have no idea if they are truly worth the price. If you'd like to share your comments, download the free WhiskyCast community app from the Apple or Google app stores and join the conversation. You can also find us on social media. Look for WhiskyCast on Threads, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and X, formerly known as Twitter, or you can email us. The address is comments@whiskycast.com. Our community segment is presented by Waterford Whiskey, where they explore the frontiers of natural flavor one farm at a time to create unique Irish whiskeys. Visit them on the web at waterfordwhiskey.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and people who make whiskey unique. Last week, we looked at the differences between blending whiskey for a single malt expression versus a blended whiskey. But how does a blender start off with a clean sheet and a mandate to create a blend from scratch? I put that question to Maureen Robinson this week.
When you start from a blend from scratch, you tend to sort of think in your head what you want. You're given a brief. Let's say this maester was all about trying to make a bourbon nose and taste like Scotch. So you have in your mind what you think you do. You use your experience of over the years of the cask and the mash bills and things like that. And what you do is you bring the samples in and then you play around with the samples to get what you think's right. You'll have in your mind a recipe you've put on paper, but then sometimes when you make that recipe up, once you put the samples in, it's not what you think it is. So you've actually got to go back to the basics again and start nosing and tasting everything again to redo it till you get the one you want.
Thanks to Maureen Robinson for the explanation. And if you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just get in touch with us through the WhiskyCast community app or on social media. That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and, of course, a complete archive of past episodes going all the way back to 2005. Get in touch with us on X, Instagram, Threads, and Facebook at WhiskyCast, or you can use the new WhiskyCast community app. Download it today from the Apple or Google app stores. Our email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
Find the new Dewar's 12-year-old and discover what all the awards are about. You can toast and thank me later. From Dewar's, the world's most awarded blended Scotch whiskey.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Ever go out drinking with a peacock? Always the same. Few too many, tail feathers come out, drinks get knocked over, bartender's not happy, night's over before it started. All I'm saying is, don't be the peacock in your group.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2023, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.